Lincolnshire, with its curving coastline, is home to many hidden treasures. Today, I'm exploring the coast and villages in the marshes. My walk will take me from Saltfleet to Theddelthorpe, taking in the tranquility of Skidbrook and exploring the dunes.
Here we have big skies and panoramic views and the smell of the sea. We're here to explore Lincolnshire's coastal marshes.
With tales of smuggling and farming, Saltfleet, like so many coastal villages, was once a thriving port. It was one of the biggest outside London from the 12th to 15th centuries. Trade between here and Europe saw the export of wool and salt, while exotic spices and building materials were brought in. The influence of Europe can be seen in the building materials chosen for the neighbouring St Clement's Church. The stone is green volcanic, which can only be found in the Rhine Valley in Germany, and most likely arrived here via boat at the haven. One thing the Lincolnshire coast is famed for is the local delicacy of samphire. This seaweed grows on the tidal marshes and has a salty taste and is delicious steamed with a bit of butter. Now, the wealth of this former trading haven can be seen in the warehouses which still stand. The area's most famous building is the New Inn, a Grade II listed 17th century hostelry, renowned in 1673 for its fish dishes and in Victorian times for its therapeutic bathing waters. Opposite stands the manor house, which may date back to the 1300s. As with so many places I've visited in Lincolnshire, the legendary Oliver Cromwell was said to have visited here, as he was friends with the owner, Lord Willoughby. In a first-floor window, etched in the glass, are the names Robert Fox and Jane Hardy and the date 1673 with a lover's knot. They were believed to have been prisoners here for 2 weeks, for Fox was once a gentleman-in-waiting to King Charles II. Now, there are plenty of walking opportunities, and nearby are the Saltfleetby Theddelthorpe dunes.
Here on the dunes, you'll always see a magnificent display from the wildlife and the flora and the fauna, with sea lavender and marsh orchids and cowslips. And if you're extremely lucky on a summer's evening, you may hear the calls of the natterjack toads, which is where some people think the expression Lincolnshire yellow belly comes from the colour of the toad.
There are also the remnants of the country's stand against the invaders, with the Second World War pillbox defending the beach.
Believe it or not, Saltfleetby was considered to have been a landing place for the Germans, and we find things like this pillbox, gun emplacements and tank traps, and they're scattered all along the coast from East Yorkshire, stretching right down the Lincolnshire coastline. There's not many of them left, but you do come across the odd one on your walk.
The marshes have a rich history stretching back to the Neolithic period, and from time to time the sand gives up its treasures. The coastline at one point would have been further inland, probably where the current road runs. At the sea edge there were many salt workings. It's where the villages get their name, and the production of salt carried on into the 16th century. In the medieval times, people started bringing their livestock off the grassland onto the marshes during the summer, where the pasture was rich. And even now, the marshes are said to be therapeutic. As part of preserving and promoting the landscape, the Lincolnshire Coastal Grazing Marshes project has been doing much work. There's more to this flat landscape than meets the eye, and I'm here to meet Joe Blissett, who's been instrumental in the project.
So Joe, we're up here and we have got such fabulous views. It is spectacular. I presume this is one of the sand dunes that we're sitting on top of at the moment. Just tell us, what was that coastal grazing project all about?
Well, it's an opportunity to put a title on a landscape, which perhaps people don't understand its significance. It's a way in which we can talk to the local communities about their area, the history of the area, but also work with local landowners to encourage them to keep pockets of grassland for wildlife, which is the historic usage of the area after the salt making had finished.
So, I mean, in front of us, we can see out to sea, and this is obviously the salt marsh area, isn't it? And then behind us, we've got cows in fields grazing as well. And then obviously somewhere in that distance, there is louse. You know, typically the landscape that we're in, has it changed much over the years?
Yeah, I mean, the landowners would often live in the high ground of the market towns, or what became the market towns. And then during the summer months, there'd be grazing beast. So first that was the Lincoln Longwool around the 13th century, and then the Lincoln Red, which is an icon of the partnership, the project that I have worked for.
Now, I know you've been working very hard on the project, and there's lots of walks that you've produced as well. I mean, for you, what makes this landscape so special? Why do you particularly like this?
You see the salt marsh, that's how it would be naturally.
Right.
But then as people were working the land and then reclaimed it for the grazing, they inadvertently created a huge landscape. Okay. And so being able to tell that story gives reasons to go on the walks, and the churches themselves are a good way of showing how the communities were moving, the wealth was coming into the area. And the churches themselves have history to tell with the materials they're built out of, which is often links with Europe and the places that the wool was being traded.
And I know when we come and we sat up the top here and we see all of this, it's so peaceful and lovely, but it would have been a hive of industry at one time, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It was the port, Saltfleet Haven, was one of the busiest and most important ports in the country. Because it was trading the goods out, and obviously in the 13th century the taxes were put on, so it became a royal port, and a lot of the wealth was coming from Saltfleet.
Yeah, it is amazing. And just tell us, the dunes that we can see, what's the history behind them? Why are they actually here then? Because they seem to be quite high, and you don't, well, I can't ever recall, especially down Cleethorpes, you don't see sand dunes like this.
No. Well, it's nice to have an elevated view. Any elevated view along the Lincolnshire coast is fantastic. It gives you that sense of the scale of the area. These dunes specifically were formed in the 11th, 12th century storms, which created a natural barrier against the sea, but obviously dunes sands move through time anyway, so they perhaps were here either further out or in a different form. Yeah,
it is beautiful, I have to say, because I think this is one area of Lincolnshire that I'm probably not really familiar with, more of the wolds, which I suppose most people are, but it's nice that, you know, the project has created the walks that people can come and learn.
Absolutely.
And share this part of the world.
Well, it's suited to cycling and walking. It's perfect for it. And people often, they know about the wolds and the fens, and the coast, as in our coastal towns of Skegness and Mablethorpe. But the bit in between the wolds and the coast, to me, is the best bit, because it's such a sort of vast landscape with all of this history that we're talking about. And it's been a privilege to have the opportunity to tell that story and get people to explore, whether that's outsiders who are in Louth, visiting the town, or the local people themselves.
Why did you decide that was the riddle, wasn't it? Why did you do the riddle?
Well, the Riddle of the Marshes was a way that I could pull together all the bits of information that I'd learnt from the local people when I'd done the consultation, so that sometimes the quirky information, sometimes it was snippets of information that I couldn't put anywhere else. And so from the oral history and the dialect to some of the smuggling stories, it occurs to me this is a great way, a great theme to explore the area, which is what I've been tasked to do.
Just today, you know, luckily we've got a nice bright sunny day, but you know, in the distance you had a bit of fog earlier. It's that changing weather changes the landscape, doesn't it, as well, and how you feel with it. But it is a beautiful place to be. there is something, I suppose, for everybody, isn't there?
Absolutely. And when you scrape the surface, you realise how important it was to the country. And sometimes that's forgotten. But I say, once you scrape the surface, it's a fascinating landscape full of all sorts of different stories.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you for talking to us. And, you know, let's hope people come down here and see this.
Thank you.
Leaving Joe behind, I set off to explore some of the many churches in this landscape. And what you notice about them is that they lean, which has made them an icon. And many also stand alone, isolated from villagers. It's not clear why this is, but could be they served scattered settlements. At nearby Skidbrook stands the church of St Botolph, the patron saint of wayfarers. What's interesting is that Botolph was also said to have rid the marshes of their devils. And in later years, sadly, this church has been at the centre of some strange goings-on. But the church itself can be dated back to the early 13th century, and like so many churches in this area, it's now redundant. And over the years, it's undergone many transformations. Join me after the break when I continue the history of Skidbrook and carry on my exploration of the marshes and its landscape and meet some more of the people connected to it.
The faces, they're really ugly, I have to say.
They're
They're not very pretty faces,
No, they're
are they?
Lincolnshire, with its curving coastline, is home to many hidden treasures. Today I'm exploring the coast and villages in the marshes. From Saltfleet, my route to Theddelthorpe will see me taking in the tranquillity of Skidbrook and Saltfleetby. The marshes landscape is dotted with churches, many isolated from their villages. Skidbrook is one such church. Made from limestone, it stands resplendent in the Lincolnshire landscape. It was last used in 1973 and is now under the care of the church's Preservation Trust.
When I come to this church, I always get a feeling of great sadness here. And I think that's because when you walk in, it's not like churches that we know complete with furniture. It simply is just a building. But at the same time, it's almost like you've stepped back to how the church was maybe when it was being built, because we get to see the stonework without all the trappings and adornments. But we can see little sneak previews, I suppose, of how it was transformed over the centuries. You know, there's bits of red paint that you can see peeping out through stonework, different arches, which shows how the church has changed and evolved over those centuries. Now it literally is just a shell, but it's also quite a tranquil place. When you're here, you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody around, and it's very, very peaceful at the same time. But also, I still get that feeling of sadness when I look at the building as it is now. But it's still beautiful.
In neighbouring Saltfleetby, they have two churches, but I'm going to All Saints to meet Martin Chapman, custodian and also chairman of Louth Museum, to find out more about this beautiful building.
This, Martin, is absolutely fabulous church, isn't it? It's absolutely beautiful.
It is.
It is stunning when you walk in.
It certainly is.
And this that's come over here to this font then.
That's right. Well, it's a octagonal font, and it dates from the 13th century, and it sat on the base is 14th century actually.
Yeah.
And the four rings that we see as designs
Yes.
on this font is what's known as quatrefoils,
Right.
and they stand for the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John.
Yeah.
And it is said many years ago there's some staining, red staining on this stone.
Oh yes, you can just see that, yeah.
Base, and it is said that it's blood from one of Oliver Cromwell's army came in here to shelter at some point.
Oh.
And it's only possible.
We hear a lot about Oliver Cromwell in this neck of the woods, don't we?
He seemed to be in every church and every house and every pub and everywhere all the time.
They all wanted a piece of him.
I've no doubt it's not all true, but some may well be.
The faces, they're really ugly, I have to say.
They're
They're not very pretty faces,
No, they're
are they?
No,
He's sticking his tongue out.
Very gruesome, and I've got to say, I don't know much about them.
So over here, we've got some bells.
We
Where
have
have these
indeed.
come from?
Well, I'm involved with several churches in this area in keeping it tidy and trying to keep them safe and maintenance and one thing and another. In conjunction actually with a number of other people, local people, that's volunteers as well. Mm-hmm. And those 3 bells that we're now looking at actually come from Skidbrook St Botolph's Church.
Right.
And a lot of the, what you might call valuable things, were all taken out of the church a number of years ago, and the 3 bells were brought here for safekeeping.
Do you know what these date from at all?
I don't.
No. Pretty heavy.
They're very heavy. The rood screen that we're looking at now, it's of great age actually, and perpendicular, and it would have been painted at one time.
I was going to say, you can see on there the red and black paint, can't you?
You can.
And these are medieval.
Definitely, yes, yeah.
I think it's fabulous, because you don't see many churches these days with those screens in place, do you?
Not originals.
No.
When those, no.
This landscape has strong ties with the sea, which also gave rise to tales of smugglers. There are many, many tales of smuggling along this coast, and one story relates to a chap called Blood, who appeared one day in Theddelthorpe.
He worked at the rectory doing odd jobs and lived in the hayloft. And in an extract from a book written in 1798, it said the villagers believed he was illiterate and vague, but he knew things like the coastal tide times. And he walked with a limp, but was able to cover large distances with his long stride. And mothers would threaten their children that if they misbehaved, then Blood would come and get them. But if anyone was to have lifted the floorboards upon which he slept, they would have discovered contraband. And it said the smuggling system along this coastline worked like clockwork under Blood.
Along the east coast, we find many ancient settlements who have a strong connection with the sea, even though now they no longer stand on its edge. Theddelthorpe is one. It means the village of the people, and I'm stopping at the 16th century village pub to meet local historian Tom Hayes.
This is because what I found sort of like in this area, there, like at Saltfleetby just down the road, there are big parishes that have lots of churches, and this one also has 2 churches, doesn't it, as well?
Yes, it does. It has one magnificent one, which is known as the Cathedral of the Marsh, the All Saints one, which dates back with Norman times,
right?
And it is redundant.
Right.
And then there's St Helen's Church, which is in use today.
Times have now changed because, like you said, one of them is now redundant.
Yes.
But you know, people clearly look after these churches still, don't they, and visit them?
Yes, they do. Yes, the St Helen's one is open, and it is used by the Methodists as well, because the chapels have also closed in the village. There used to be 2 chapels, one opposite the King's Head and one on the main road in Theddelthorpe, St Helens.
And there used to be more than one pub
Yes.
as well, didn't there?
Yes, they did. There used to be the Ship, which was on Ship Corner, and that is where you go down to the sea near Churchill Lane.
Right.
And also there was another one called the Engine, but the Engine was only a beer house.
The land itself, we've obviously got the sea just over the bank there, and there's lots of drains and dikes in the area. You're particularly passionate about one of the drainage areas, aren't you?
Yes.
Is it Gayton-le-Marsh?
Gayton Engine Pumping Station.
Okay.
It is in the parish of Gayton-le-Marsh, but it's nearer
Right.
Theddelthorpe than anywhere. And it's one where I'm chairman of a preservation society for it.
Right.
And we have it open so many times a year.
Yeah.
And it used to have an old steam engine in, but today we've just got the diesel engine in there, which was made redundant in about 1956.
Okay. And when did it open?
The actual station opened as a steam engine around 1850.
Right. And what was it used for then?
It was basically used for pumping the water. When you got heavy rainfall, it used to pump the water into the Great O, and then it used to run out at Saltfleet. And but it was over the years the farming's changed, gone over to arable, so they had to make a better pumping station, and a new one was built.
It is a different place, isn't it? Obviously, compared to the Wold.
My wife and I enjoy walking around, especially on after Sunday lunch in the winter time. We often go for a walk around the sandhills, and it's you don't hardly see a soul, and it's so you cannot believe what it's like.
It's worth exploring Theddelthorpe All Saints, for it is a beautiful church and deserves its title Cathedral of the Marsh. Built around 1380, its exterior is a mix of stone and red brick. Inside, it's a delight, being light and airy and containing many fine features. There's a beautifully carved rood screen with some interesting, intricate carvings which dates back from the 15th century. And if you look carefully on the piers and on the pews, you'll find evidence of graffiti, for someone has spent the time to carve images of old sailing boats. The pews also have poppy heads carved into them. In fact, every part of this wondrous building has some kind of carving, and what I love is that it's here for you to admire. And so another journey ends. We've met so many interesting people, and we've learnt so much more about the history of its landscape and the folk shaped by it. It's been a journey exploring churches which, though no longer used, are not really redundant, having found new uses for the people who live here. And what I would say is, if you've never been and explored the marshes, then get yourself down here. Until next time, happy rambling!